Why would someone who possesses the whole truth choose silence precisely when their life is at stake? Have you ever stopped to think about that? Imagine the scene for a moment and try to place yourself there, in that atmosphere charged with tension, fear, and power. Jesus stands before Pilate, handcuffed, surrounded by Roman soldiers, while the crowd outside shouts, accuses, and demands condemnation. The Roman governor speaks, asks questions, provokes, tries to elicit some reaction. And Jesus remains silent, a profound, disconcerting, almost uncomfortable silence. What is happening here? Perhaps you've experienced something similar. A moment when you had arguments, you were right, you had words on the tip of your tongue, but something inside you told you not to answer. Have you ever been through that? This kind of silence is often interpreted as weakness, defeat, or fear. But when we look at Jesus before Pilate, we realize that this is not an ordinary silence. It is a silence that speaks, a silence that carries a spiritual strength that few can see. Pilate represents political power, human authority, the man who holds the decision over life and death in his hands. He is used to seeing people plead, justify themselves, negotiate. But Jesus does none of that. He doesn't defend himself, doesn't explain himself, doesn't try to convince anyone. While Pilate insists on his questions, Jesus remains silent. Pilate speaks. Jesus is silent. And this contrast is disturbing. Jesus' silence breaks all the logic of that trial. What's most intriguing is to consider that this same Jesus had spoken to multitudes, confronted Pharisees, cast out demons, and taught with authority like no one else ever had. He was not someone without a voice. On the contrary, his words had power. So why now, at the most decisive moment in history, does he choose not to speak? What does this silence reveal about spiritual authority, trust in God, and the true power that doesn't depend on words? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may deeply surprise you. This episode, which we often read quickly in the Gospels, hides little-known historical and spiritual revelations. Jesus' gestures, silences, and attitudes reveal hidden teachings capable of transforming how you deal with conflicts, injustices, and situations where everything seems to be out of your control. Jesus' silence before Pilate is not empty. It is full of meaning. It confronts our constant need to defend ourselves, to prove who we are, to always have the last word. How many times do we think that if we remain silent, we will lose? How many times do we feel we need to react immediately so as not to appear weak? What if this impulse is distancing us from a deeper trust in God? While Pilate tries to understand who is before him, Jesus already knows exactly who he is. He knows the purpose of that moment. He knows that something greater is at play. His silence is not passivity, it is surrender. It is not defeat, it is spiritual authority in action. It is the absolute confidence of one who knows that God's plan does not depend on human explanations. Perhaps that's why this scene still baffles us today, because it forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. Do we trust God enough to remain silent when everything within us wants to react? Do we understand that not every battle is won with words? As we delve deeper into this episode, you'll realize that Jesus' silence wasn't an insignificant detail, but a powerful choice, full of intention and meaning. There's something hidden there, something that goes unnoticed by most people, but that can completely change how you see authority, faith, and trust in God. And that's exactly what we'll begin to explore from now on. And as we walk through this intense scenario, it's impossible not to notice how this scene touches something very personal within us. Because in some way, we've all faced a Pilate in life, a situation where we were questioned, pressured, or judged, and had to decide between reacting or trusting. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far. Perhaps an experience where silence spoke louder than any words, or a moment when you felt God calling you to trust more and explain less. Your story can strengthen someone who is going through something similar right now. If this reflection is helping you see the Bible in a deeper, more human, and at the same time more spiritual way, please consider liking this video. This simple gesture shows YouTube that this type of message needs to reach more people who are also searching for answers, meaning, and spiritual direction. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and continue bringing content that explores the gestures, silences, and attitudes of Jesus that often go unnoticed. If you feel that this type of content resonates with your faith, your spiritual journey, and the challenges of daily life, subscribe to the channel. This way, you'll join me on this journey of discovering profound teachings that go beyond words and help build a community of people who want to grow together, reflect together, and learn together. Here, every comment, every like, and every subscription isn't just a number. It's voices, stories, and hearts connected by a common purpose. And now, with all this in mind, let's continue moving forward in this scene, as silent as it is powerful, because there is still much to be revealed in this encounter between Jesus and Pilate, and what comes next may completely change how you understand authority, faith, and trust in God. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because to understand the impact of Jesus' silence, we need to look closely at who was standing before him. Pilate was not just a curious man asking questions. He was the direct representative of the Roman Empire, the greatest political and military power of that time. His authority came not only from an administrative position, but from the force of a system that governed through fear, intimidation, and the certainty that the final word always came from power. Pilate was accustomed to controlling situations, conducting interrogations, and breaking down resistance. People trembled before him. People talked too much before him. People defended themselves, pleaded, negotiated. That's how the game worked. Within this logic, Jesus' silence becomes even more disconcerting, because he doesn't react. He doesn't defend himself. He doesn't try to negotiate his freedom. He doesn't enter the power game. And this creates an invisible noise in that room. A silence that is not empty, but laden with meaning. Pilate asks, insists, provokes. And the more Jesus remains silent, the more the governor seems to lose control of the situation. It's as if Jesus' silence dismantles, piece by piece, the machinery of human authority. The biblical text makes this very clear when it says that Pilate was greatly astonished. It's not a superficial astonishment. It's perplexity. It's confusion. It's someone who has always been in command realizing, even unconsciously, that something beyond his control is happening there. Matthew records that Jesus did not respond to any accusation, and this does not infuriate Pilate. It destabilizes him. Because power expects a reaction. Power feeds on response. Power needs confrontation to assert itself, and Jesus offers silence. This detail completely changes the dynamics of the trial. At that moment, it seems that Pilate has Jesus in his hands, but the feeling that emerges is the opposite. Who is really in control of the situation? Who dictates the pace? Who defines the meaning of that encounter? The man sitting in the chair of power or the shackled prisoner who chooses not to speak? This question runs through the biblical text and reaches us as a hidden truth, challenging our mindset about strength, authority, and victory. Historically, Pilate was known for being harsh, pragmatic, and insensitive to the religious issues of the Jews. For him, it was more of a political problem to be solved. But something in that silence throws him off balance. Because Jesus doesn't act like someone cornered. There is no explicit fear. There is no despair. There is a serenity that doesn't match the scene. And this serenity communicates something that words could not express. Communicates confidence. Communicates conviction. It communicates an authority that does not depend on positions, titles, or armies. This is where the reflection begins to deepen. Because Jesus' silence is not a defense strategy, it's a spiritual stance. He knows exactly who he is and knows he doesn't need to explain himself to uphold his identity. He doesn't try to convince Pilate of anything, because truth doesn't need validation once it's established. This silence reveals a completely different mindset from ours, a mindset that doesn't react impulsively, that doesn't let itself be driven by the pressure of the moment, that doesn't compromise principles to escape pain. When we look at this closely, we realize that this episode is not just about a historical trial. It's about decisions, about silent choices that shape destinies, about the impact of not responding when everyone expects an answer, about the inner transformation that happens when someone trusts more in purpose than in the immediate result. Jesus isn't interested in winning that debate, because what's at stake is something much bigger than that moment. There's a journey being undertaken there, and silence is part of it. This type of attitude directly confronts our way of dealing with conflict. We live in a culture that values quick reactions, sharp responses, and the constant defense of one's own image. Silence in this context is seen as a loss. But before Pilate, silence becomes a revelation. It exposes the fragility of human power, which needs external control to assert itself, while spiritual authority is sustained from within. Pilate has the power to order crucifixion. Jesus has the power to remain faithful to the truth even before the cross. There is something profoundly transformative in realizing that Jesus' silence does not weaken him, but strengthens him. He is not silent for lack of arguments, but because his mission did not depend on explanations. He does not defend himself because he was not trying to save his own image, but to fulfill a greater purpose. And this forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. How many times do we talk too much because we are trying to control what is not in our hands? How many times do we react because we confuse authority with imposition? The encounter between Jesus and Pilate reveals the inner workings of a battle that is not visible to ordinary eyes. A battle between two types of power. One that imposes itself from the outside in, and another that sustains itself from the inside out. One that needs answers, and another that rests in truth. One that threatens and another that trusts. And in this silent clash, something begins to become clear. The authority that truly transforms does not shout, does not force, does not negotiate principles. As this scene unfolds, Jesus' silence continues to resonate, traversing centuries, challenging generations to rethink their decisions, their mindset, and their way of reacting to pressure. He invites us on a deeper journey, where not everything needs to be said, where not every accusation requires a response, where trust in God completely redefines what it means to be in control. And perhaps it is precisely here that this text begins to touch on something personal, because we all face moments when silence seems too risky, too uncomfortable, too vulnerable. But what we see before Pilate is that this silence does not stem from fear, but from a profound certainty. A certainty that does not depend on anyone's approval. A certainty that sustains difficult decisions. A certainty that reveals an invisible yet real authority. Leave a comment below, writing just one sentence or word that represents what this silence evokes in you, such as, "This makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because here common logic begins to crumble. There's a deeply ingrained, almost automatic idea within us that whoever doesn't defend themselves loses. From an early age we learn that remaining silent is a sign of weakness, that not responding is agreeing, that not reacting is being defeated. This mentality shapes decisions, behaviors, and even how we relate to the world. But when faced with Jesus in silence, this structure begins to break down from within. Jesus' silence is not an absence of response. It is the ultimate expression of spiritual authority. He doesn't engage in the game because he doesn't need to prove anything. Everything that needed to be said had already been said throughout his journey. Every teaching, every miracle, every previous confrontation had already communicated the truth with absolute clarity. There, before Pilate, there was no need to add words, because the purpose did not depend on convincing anyone at that moment. It depended on remaining faithful to what had already been established. This is a hidden truth that completely changes how we perceive strength and power. Jesus didn't remain silent because he lacked power. He remained silent because he had enough power. Power not to react impulsively. Power not to defend himself out of fear. Power not to compromise his identity in exchange for immediate relief. This kind of power isn't learned from manuals. It isn't acquired through external authority. It isn't sustained by applause. It is born from a deep conviction, from a mindset aligned with something greater than mere survival. When we understand this, we begin to realize that Jesus' silence is a conscious act, not an omission. He chooses not to speak because he knows that any word there would only be noise in the face of the truth that was already unfolding. This requires a level of spiritual maturity that challenges everything we are used to seeing. It is the kind of posture that generates impact not through noise, but through firmness. Not through reaction, but through constancy. This scene invites us to look inward and reflect on our own decisions. How many times do we feel the urgent need to explain ourselves, justify ourselves, defend ourselves, even when we know who we are and what our purpose is? How many times do we talk too much because we are trying to fill an insecurity that has not yet been healed? Jesus' silence exposes these inner workings and shows us that true authority begins when we no longer need to prove anything to anyone. There is a silent transformation that happens when someone truly understands this. the mindset changes. The way of reacting changes. Choices become guided less by the fear of losing and more by the certainty of who one is. Jesus knew exactly who he was before entering that room. And because he knew, he could remain silent without losing himself. Silence, in this case, does not erase one's identity. It reveals it. This lesson is deeply uncomfortable because it takes us out of our comfort zone. It forces us to accept that not every situation requires a response, that not every accusation deserves an explanation, that not every provocation needs to be confronted. There are times when speaking weakens us, and silence strengthens us. Not because we are running away, but because we are confident enough not to react. The spiritual impact of this stance is enormous. Jesus shows that authority is not linked to the quantity of words, but to the consistency between who one is and how one acts. He doesn't need to raise his voice to affirm his truth. It is already within him. And this teaches us that the spiritual journey is not about winning debates, but about remaining whole even when we are misunderstood. Observing this scene, it becomes clear that Jesus' silence is not passive. It is active. He communicates more than any speech could at that moment. He communicates self-control. He communicates surrender. He communicates a radical trust in God's plan. And this trust completely redefines the concept of victory. Because winning there was not about escaping the cross but about remaining faithful to the end. When we bring this into our reality, we realize how relevant this teaching still is. We live in times of constant exposure, of quick opinions, of immediate answers. Silence seems strange, almost suspicious. But Jesus reveals to us that there are times when silence is the most powerful decision one can make. Not out of fear of the consequences, but out of clarity of purpose. This clarity changes everything. It changes how we face conflict. It changes how we deal with injustice. It even changes how we perceive success and failure. Because when we know who we are and who we trust, silence ceases to be a threat and becomes a refuge. A place where the truth doesn't need to shout to exist. And as this understanding deepens, something begins to stir within us. A silent question begins to arise. What if part of our emotional and spiritual exhaustion comes precisely from the fact that we speak when we should rest in what we already know? What if many internal battles would be different if we learned to trust more and react less? This scene before Pilate continues to lead us to a deeper place, where silence ceases to be seen as weakness and comes to be recognized as an expression of an authority that does not depend on circumstances. There are still important layers to be revealed in this attitude of Jesus, layers that directly touch our relationship with God, with suffering, and with complete trust. Leave a comment below, writing only, "This makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because here Jesus' silence ceases to be merely a demonstration of authority and begins to reveal something even more intimate, an absolute trust in God. It's not just about not reacting to human power, but about resting completely in the Father's plan, even when everything seems to be heading towards pain, injustice, and loss. Jesus' silence before Pilate stems from this profound place of surrender, where there is no need to control the outcome because trust is already established. Isaiah describes this impressively when he says that he was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. This text does not speak of passivity, but of obedience. It does not speak of empty resignation, but of a conscious decision to trust. Jesus does not remain silent because he feels no fear or pain, but because he chooses to obey even while feeling all of that. Silence, in this context, becomes a spiritual language, a way of saying, "Father, I trust in you more than I trust in circumstances." This is a hard truth to swallow because it confronts us directly. Trusting is far more challenging than reacting. Reacting gives us a sense of control. Trusting places us in a vulnerable position. And that's exactly where Jesus' silence begins to resemble our own lives. How many times does God call us to trust and not to react? How many times do we feel that if we don't do something immediately, everything will fall apart? Jesus' silence shows us that sometimes the most powerful act is not to act, but to surrender. There is a profound transformation that occurs when someone learns to trust at that level. The mindset changes. The way of facing crises changes. Decisions cease to be guided solely by the anxiety of the present and begin to be shaped by the certainty of a greater purpose. Jesus knew that that moment was part of a journey that did not end there. His silence carries this awareness. The story does not end in judgment, nor on the cross, nor in apparent defeat. This kind of trust doesn't spring from nothing. It's built along the way. Jesus had already spent years in communion with the Father, aligning his will, strengthening his identity, living in obedience. When the most difficult moment arrives, he doesn't need to hastily create faith. It's already there. The silence before Pilate is merely the visible expression of an invisible relationship built behind the scenes of prayer, intimacy, and daily surrender. And this is where the connection with our reality becomes inevitable. Often, we want to experience profound spiritual results without going through the process that sustains them. We want confidence without relationship. We want peace without surrender. We want meaningful silence without first having built a solid foundation with God. Jesus' silence reveals to us that silent obedience is the fruit of a lifetime of alignment with the Father. Silence, in this context, is not about self-annihilation. It's about placing oneself completely in God's hands. It's about recognizing that not everything depends on our explanation, our defense, or our reaction. There are times when God calls us to walk by faith and not by logic, to trust when everything within us demands control, to obey when we don't fully understand the path. This silence as surrender also teaches us about limits. Jesus knew how far he needed to go with words, and he knew when it was time to stop. He doesn't try to convince Pilate of God's plan, because that wasn't Pilate's role. He doesn't try to justify the suffering to come, because the cross didn't need to be explained at that moment. There is a profound wisdom in knowing when to speak and when to confide. Emotionally, this touches us because we have all been in situations where speaking seemed useless. Moments when explaining wouldn't change the heart of the person listening. Situations where reacting would only increase the pain. In those moments, Jesus' silence comforts us and teaches us that trusting in God doesn't mean ignoring reality, but choosing to face it with faith. The spiritual impact of this teaching is enormous because it redefines what it means to be strong. Strength here is not about dominating the situation, but about surrendering to purpose. It is not about avoiding suffering at all costs, but about remaining obedient even when the path is difficult. Jesus' silence shows us that there is a peace that does not come from the absence of conflict, but from the certainty that God is in control, even when everything seems out of place. This total trust does not eliminate human fear, but it puts it into perspective. Jesus is not silent because he feels no anguish, but because he trusts the Father more than his own feelings. This is profoundly liberating, because it reminds us that faith is not the absence of emotions, but the choice not to be governed by them. Observing this silence invites us to reflect on our own journeys, on the moments when God asks us for patience when we want haste, silence when we want an immediate answer, surrender when we want guarantees. These silent choices, almost invisible to others, build something within us that no words could ever create. And perhaps that's exactly what touches us most in this scene. Realizing that Jesus' silence is not the end of the story, but an essential part of it, a necessary step within a larger plan, a decision that, even though it seems small on the outside, carries an eternal weight within. This silence prepares us to understand something even deeper about the relationship between obedience, suffering, and purpose. As this trust unfolds, we are led to see silence not as an absence of action, but as a space where God works invisibly, where inner decisions produce eternal impacts, where silent surrender transforms into redemption. Write in the comments, "I'm on this journey too." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because here we enter into one of the most silent and, at the same time, most transformative teachings of Jesus' life. There is a little explored revelation in this episode that completely changes the way we understand communication, faith, and spiritual maturity. Jesus speaks when he teaches. He explains, confronts, reveals, guides, but he remains silent when the purpose is greater than any explanation. This detail is fundamental because it shows that silence is not the absence of truth, but submission to something greater than immediate understanding. Throughout the Gospels, we see Jesus speaking clearly when the goal is to educate, heal, and awaken consciousness. He uses parables, answers difficult questions, and confronts hypocrisy. But before Pilate, When it is no longer a matter of teaching but of fulfilling an eternal purpose, he chooses silence. This reveals a mature spiritual mindset, capable of discerning when words build up and when they merely distract from what is essential. Not every truth needs to be spoken the moment it is questioned. This is a hidden truth that directly touches our daily lives. We live in a culture that values quick responses, immediate explanations, and constant defense. We are taught to believe that if we don't take a stand verbally, we lose ground. But Jesus' silence presents us with another path. A path where discernment is worth more than reaction. Where purpose is worth more than momentary victory. Where the depth of what is being built matters more than the noise of what is being disputed. Not every battle is won with words. This phrase takes on a different weight when we look at the scene of the trial. Jesus doesn't try to win that argument because that wasn't the main battle. The cross wouldn't be avoided with arguments, and redemption wouldn't come through convincing explanations. Silence there protects the purpose, prevents the focus from shifting, keeps the journey on the right path, even when everything around seems unfair. This perspective helps us understand why talking too much often wears us down, while conscious silence strengthens us. How many arguments enter our lives only to throw us off balance? How many injustices provoke us emotionally, demanding an immediate response that, in the end, only prolongs the pain? Jesus' silence teaches us that responding to everything is to become a hostage to any provocation. Silence, when guided by discernment, is choosing where to invest energy, time, and soul. This doesn't mean ignoring problems or accepting abuse. Jesus' silence isn't cowardice. It's a spiritual strategy. He doesn't remain silent out of fear of confrontation, but because he knows that specific confrontation wouldn't produce transformation. There's a huge difference between being silent out of fear and being silent out of clarity. Jesus knew exactly what he was doing. His silence wasn't internal confusion. It was deep alignment with the Father's purpose. When we put this into practice, we realize how relevant this teaching is today. In family, professional, or emotional discussions, how often do we speak only to relieve internal tension, not to actually resolve the issue? In moments of injustice, how many words are spoken more to prove a point than to promote transformation? In emotional or spiritual attacks, how many reactions arise from the wound and not from wisdom? Jesus' silence invites us to a conscious pause, where we choose to respond only when the response contributes to something greater. There is a profound impact when we learn this. Our mindset changes. We start asking less, how do I win this argument? And more, does this really need my response right now? This shift seems simple, but it transforms relationships, decisions, and even how we deal with our own faith. Because we learn that not every provocation deserves our voice, and not every accusation defines who we are. Behind the scenes of spiritual life, silence is often where God works most intensely. It is in silence that intentions are purified, emotions are organized, and decisions mature. Jesus shows us that speaking at the wrong time can distract from the purpose, while remaining silent at the right time can protect something sacred that is still in process. This teaching also helps us deal with spiritual attacks, those that come not only from the outside, but from within. Accusatory thoughts, old guilts, insecurities that try to provoke us to react impulsively. Silence, in these moments, is not denying reality, but choosing not to feed what weakens us. It is trusting that the truth does not need to be repeated all the time to remain true. As this revelation deepens, we begin to see silence as a spiritual language. A language that communicates trust, discernment, and maturity. Jesus shows us that there are battles that are won by standing firm, not by explaining everything. By remaining aligned, not by trying to convince everyone. By remaining faithful, even when we are misunderstood. This kind of attitude changes how we navigate injustice. Instead of getting lost in it, we learn to navigate it without losing who we are. Silence, here, doesn't erase the pain, but it prevents the pain from defining us. Creates space for God to act where our words cannot reach. And as this understanding expands, we realize that Jesus' silence does not end the communication. It prepares something deeper. It opens space for an even greater revelation, which can only be understood when we realize that God's purpose is not always explained, but always fulfilled. Comment below writing, "This makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because everything we've seen so far begins to come together in something extremely practical, real, and transformative for our lives today. Jesus' silence before Pilate is not just a distant episode in biblical history, nor a curious detail from the Gospels. It carries direct teachings that transcend time and find their way into our own journey, especially in moments when we are pressured, questioned, or wronged. The first lesson is simple, yet profoundly counterintuitive. Authority doesn't need to shout. We live in a world where whoever speaks loudest often seems stronger, more confident, more in control. But Jesus shows us the opposite. True authority doesn't depend on volume, insistence, or external approval. It comes from within. Pilate had the voice, the position, the political power. Jesus had something much more solid: conviction, identity, and purpose. And this completely changes our mindset about leadership, influence, and spiritual strength. When we understand this, we begin to realize how many times we waste energy trying to prove something that should already be resolved within ourselves. How many times do we raise our voices because we are insecure? How many times do we defend ourselves because we haven't yet settled into the truth about who we are? Jesus' silence reveals that those who are secure in their own identity don't need to constantly compete for space. They simply remain. Another powerful teaching is this: those who trust in God don't need to constantly justify themselves. Jesus knew that no explanation would change that scenario. He also knew that the Father was in control, even when everything seemed to be heading towards chaos. This kind of trust redefines how we deal with accusations, judgments, and external expectations. Not every opinion needs a response. Not every misinterpretation needs to be corrected immediately. There are times when justifying ourselves only binds us more to what God is already guiding. This doesn't mean indifference, but discernment. There is a spiritual maturity in knowing when to speak and when to be silent. Jesus wasn't always silent. He spoke when it was necessary to teach, confront, reveal. But at that specific moment, silence was the language most faithful to the purpose. This teaches us that faith is not about reacting automatically, but about consciously choosing how to act. Silence, then, ceases to be an uncomfortable void and becomes an act of faith. A silence that trusts, a silence that surrenders, a silence that obeys. In an anxious world that demands immediate answers and quick solutions, the silence of Jesus invites us to a different rhythm. A rhythm where trust in God is greater than the need for control. Where decisions are made based on purpose, and not just on the pressure of the moment. This teaching has a direct impact on our relationships, our choices, and even how we face pain and injustice. How many situations in our lives could have been different if we had learned to be silent at the right time? How many conflicts have intensified because we spoke driven by emotion and not by wisdom? Jesus' silence shows us that the quickest answer is not always the truest, and the strongest reaction is not always the most effective. There is also something very liberating in this learning. When we understand that silence can be an act of faith, we stop feeling guilty for not responding to everything. We stop carrying the burden of needing to explain every decision, every choice, every limit. We begin to trust that God sees what others don't see, knows intentions that no one else knows, and acts even when everything seems at a standstill. The final statement that emerges from all of this is not only beautiful, it is profoundly true. Jesus' silence was not an absence of response, it was the most powerful response in history. Because in that silence, he affirmed who he was. He revealed in whom he trusted. He showed that God's purpose cannot be interrupted by human accusations. And that response continues to resonate today, challenging our mindset, our decisions, and our way of living our faith. When we look at this scene with this level of depth, something changes within us. We begin to see silence not as defeat, but as a space for maturity. Not as weakness, but as directed strength. Not as escape, but as alignment with something greater. This understanding transforms the way we navigate difficult times, because we start asking less, how do I defend myself? And more, who do I trust? And this question naturally leads us to an even deeper place, where Jesus' silence ceases to be merely an example and becomes a personal invitation. An invitation to reconsider our reactions, our motivations, and our way of trusting God when the path doesn't make sense. There are also important layers in this silence that reveal how God acts precisely when everything seems too quiet, too invisible, too still. Comment below writing, "This makes sense to me." And if everything we've shared together so far has touched you in some way, perhaps it's a sign that this content is also part of your own journey. If this type of reflection, which goes beyond words and delves into the gestures, silences, and attitudes of Jesus, resonates with your faith and your real life, then it makes sense for you to subscribe to the channel. This way, you can continue to follow content that helps you see the Bible with more depth, clarity, and meaning in your daily life. If you've made it this far, write something simple in the comments, just to mark this moment. It could be, "This message was for me," or "I'm with you until the end." This helps create a connection with those watching and shows that this conversation doesn't end here. And if, at any point in the video, you felt that these words touched your heart, leave a like. It's a silent, but very real way of saying that this content resonated with you and helping this message reach more people. And to continue along this same line of thought, there's a video here that perfectly complements this topic. Click on it and continue the conversation with me there. We can keep talking.